as Shakespeare said, the men and women are only players. Very true, particularly on the political stage. Once you see that most things that come out of politicians' mouths are actually intended to manipulate you into supporting what they want to do, which is not necessarily something good for people, then it's really hard to unsee that.
What indicators are telltale signs that this democracy is not functioning anymore?
Yeah, they'd like to be able to engage in this game of mates. There's a new version of that called rigged politicians who have figured out ways in which to siphon wealth and status their way and towards what is best for the captains of industry, the elites.
What are the key triggers points of Western Australia?
Indicate that Western Australia is bleeding something on the order of $39 billion per year. The elimination of income tax, the elimination of company tax, payroll tax, 13 different federal taxes.
Before we get started, please subscribe so that you never miss an episode of our cutting-edge contemporary conversations. Thank you.
Welcome, Gigi. How are you?
Very well. Thank you, Dev. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for time today, and I'm so glad that you're here in Perth so that we can do a sit-down conversation. Could you broadly, yes, I understand you're an economist and you have very diverse views on different topics, but before we delve into your views and opinions, which are fact-based, I would assume, I want you to understand your story. That how do you end up liking as a young girl, getting into the idea of tracking numbers, following evidence, being an economist?
Right.
Where it started?
Okay, very good question. So I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so I'm American. And I went to a private all-girls school, learned French from the age of 5, did mostly languages, humanities, things like this. Didn't really think I was that good at math. I mean, I got good grades, but I didn't really see it as useful, I suppose, for a while. I was very good at languages. When I went to university, I thought I was going to be a comparative linguist for a while. Then I thought I might also potentially be a performing arts administrator because I'm very good at that. I was in all the performing arts, so dancing and acting and singing and playing piano. I did all that stuff. My father's an engineer. My mother's a psychologist.
Okay.
And when I was about, maybe this is educative in terms of my nature, when I was about probably, 10 or something, I was riding in a car with my mother, and she, as she often did, asked me a very kind of deep question, ad hoc on the fly, between lessons probably. We were driving from ice skating to horseback riding or something, and she said, "So Gigi, what do you think the point of life is?" And I said, apparently, immediately, with no delay at all, well, to make other people happy.
Okay.
And then she followed up with, well, what about yourself? And I remember being kind of flummoxed by that question and thinking, I don't know how to answer that question. And I think with hindsight now, I realized that the reason I didn't know how to answer it is because I had already really provided the answer, which is, if I make people happy, if I manage with my actions to give a better life to others, that makes me happy. So I'm already achieving that end. So that is the end that I'm sort of very naturally oriented towards. I want to improve the world for other people. And so that was the message of economics that I was most drawn to when I was in university. When I shopped in economics class, it was Microeconomics 1 by John Giannakopoulos, which I only went to during shopping period at Yale because a friend of mine passed me on the path and said, "Hey, I've just been here. I think you'd like it." So I went, and they played the market game, that lecture, so I could see how demand and supply curves were drawn, and the brilliant efficiency of the market mechanism and the one price and everything. And I thought, this is a discipline that's codified the way I already think, which is in terms of resource allocative efficiency and how to get the most out of the scarce resources we have for people, for the thriving of humanity. And so that was really what drew me in. It was very much a human thing. So it wasn't as much the numbers initially. It was very much the human element of the discipline, and the fact that it studies everything from what's going on in the human heart to how can we structure an institution, how can we structure a whole system to accommodate the realities of human nature. So I have very much my mother's orientation towards understanding people and my father's orientation towards optimizing systems. And I'm a very practical person. And I also think I'm missing a little bit of wiring in regard to social approval. So it just doesn't matter to me that much whether other people agree with me. I want to get as close as I can to finding the truth. And we're never there, but we're always hopefully making progress in that direction. And whether or not other people think that what I decide is the best guess at truth today is, in fact, for them, the best guess at truth is kind of immaterial to me. It's part of the human condition that we have diverse perspectives and opinions, and we're at different points on the journey of our own enlightenment, all of us, in different ways. And so I see it as a great pleasure, actually, to discuss ideas with people who disagree with me, because I may learn something, they may learn something. We may make progress together. We may decide, there is something we agree about, and we can then think, oh, yes, this is some direction that we can all move in a society. This would be better for us. So from the time I was a very young child, I've enjoyed those kinds of conversations with my extended family, and then with my classmates, and of course now with the wider world.
Why do you think in a society which is evolving all the time and so much dynamic, and when people whether they're scientists, economists, doctors, lawyers, when they're fact-finding, we don't need a social proof. We don't need a social license to find facts. So, because if the majority of the country decides that is right or that is wrong, that is democratic from a point of view of political ideology or understanding to run a democracy or a functioning democracy. But from a fact-finding point of view, getting a social proof of doing a research, doing a fact-finding, how is that, either that is defunct or not relevant, or how do you see that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that the modern day democracies, including Australia's, have weakened over time. I think the voice of the people in actually directing the machinery of state is much weaker today than it was, for example, the founding of Australia or the founding of the United States, my country of birth. And so when you talk about the democratic voice or the voice of the people, I think actually a lot of the decisions currently made by people in authority are not reflective of what is best for the people or what the people have voiced that they want. It's much more what an elite that have gained power and have more power than elites in the recent past have decided is good for them and their mates and for their own careers and for their own preservation of their status and their wealth, rather than what is actually good for the people as a whole. So we say democracy, but de facto it doesn't feel like a democracy to me. And so I think that in that situation, you definitely have a very strong role for independent voices who are not tethered to the political system and not tethered to a particular brand of fact-finding or research, who just have decided, okay, I'd like to study this, and ideally a very diverse team, a team which has, and in fact this is a team I'm working on right now with my current project, Secession by WA, which is got a lawyer and a health practitioner and myself, an economist, and another economist, and we're all taking a different perspective on this research project, which is, would it be feasible and would it be good for Western Australia to secede from the Commonwealth? How could we set the society up such that it would be better for people here in WA than what we have at the moment? And I think there's a role for us because we have no political connections. I'm very apolitical. I like to say I take policy from whichever side of politics gives the best policy option. I don't care whether it's left, right, center, or otherwise. I'm not an ideologue. I'm a practical person. So I tend to find these days that the arguments that are put forth by the right side of the spectrum tend to be more commonsensical, but that maybe wasn't always true. Could have been that 50 years ago it would have been the left side that was coming up with the more commonsensical policies. I haven't studied that in depth, but I don't really care. So I'm really very much not oriented towards politics. I'm very much oriented towards just independent discovery of the best ways to do things for people. And so, yes, I think there's a role for that because in a society where a lot of the institutions have been captured in various ways by special interests, you need a voice for the people as a whole that is not tethered to those special interests, that is using diverse means of researching what might be best for us, and that can then have an avenue to get that information out, which of course is independent podcasts and Substacks and all these other kinds of independent media that have sprung up, particularly since the COVID era, but even before then, and potentially mainstream media. I mean, sometimes I get covered in the mainstream media, that's great, but I would trust a team like that myself if I was evaluating some other area of policy more than I would an internal team within a political system these days, because of the degree of corruption that I know has infiltrated, has basically arisen in a lot of our Western institutions.
In your observation as an economist point of view, you track variables and indicators, and for a functioning democracy, and when you call it a dysfunctioning democracy, what are the tilting, what's the red, green, and amber zone of what indicators are telltale signs that this democracy is not functioning anymore? This democracy, it looks or acts like in the facade of it, but it is not functioning as a democracy?
Yeah, great question. And I wish more people would ask this sort of question. I think there's a number of different indicators. I wouldn't pin my hat on just one. One of them certainly would be the barometers of trust in institutions that we have access to. So there are public surveys of how much do you trust institutions in general, government institutions, health institutions, education institutions, et cetera. There is also the degree to which laws are generated, pages and pages of laws. So the more legislation is passed per day, I think the worse probably the democracy is going, because the likelihood is, I can bet you right now, every listener of this podcast will have some error in their interpretation of what the legal situation is in their residence, wherever it is. There's no way we could get across the mountains of legislation that apply to our everyday lives. Right? Technically apply. So there's this big difference, a huge gap between the formal legislation that's been passed and actually how people have to live their everyday lives, right? And when you have that situation, you have to ask yourself, what is the point of all that extra legislation? If people who are being governed don't even know what it is, they can't even decode it, it would take a lifetime to become familiar with it. And by that point, it would have changed anyway, because again, every day more laws are passed. So I say something like the pages of legislation passed per day. Also, when you see large companies and other organizations donating to both sides of politics, that's a bad sign. Because why would you donate to both sides of politics? Right? If you think about it for a minute, you're sort of, what are you going for, right? What are you maximizing? I could imagine that potentially certain lobby groups would see either the left or the right as more likely to advance their interests when they get into power. But why both sides? They're having a bet both ways. They are hedging their bets, and they are recognizing that no matter who comes into power, they'd like to be able to play ball. They'd like to be able to engage in this game of mates, as the phrase was coined by one of my co-authors and one of his co-authors in a book called Game of Mates, How Favors Bleed the Nation, which there's a new version of that called Rigged, R-I-G-G-E-D, which basically goes through chapter by chapter the various industries and dimensions of Australian life which are corrupted now away from what is best for the people or what is best functional for that particular industry and towards what is best for the captains of industry, the elites, the governmental bureaucrats, the politicians, who have figured out ways in which to siphon wealth and status their way. So that sort of highly embedded, entrenched sort of interdependency that breeds corruption. We see that in Australia today. We also see it in other countries, but this book is particularly about Australia. And it gives rise to the notion that government is kind of willing and able to negotiate and play ball, engage in this favor exchange with other large companies or organizations, universities, let's say, for example, or research organizations or other lobby groups. And so you'll see people then, or those groups, giving money to both sides of politics because they are signaling that they are a player. So that would be another indicator. In some cases, voter turnout, or sort of marking a ballot in a way that is not valid, right? Drawing a picture on a ballot instead of actually voting, and something like that. You could see those as indicators of cynicism amongst the population. But also, how many avenues are there? You can just count. How many avenues are there for people to actually have legitimate voice if they are not already somehow collectivized into some body, into what happens in the state. Right? So at the moment we can vote, we know that.
Yeah.
We can also potentially try to influence our local councils or be involved in local governments, but that may not translate to state or Commonwealth governance. So how else can people be involved? They would have to kind of join some sort of lobby group. There's no real direct representation happening. We have this notion that democracy should be directly, representing the voice of the people as a whole, not just a collection of lobby groups. Yeah? But that's not really so much the case in Australia. I think that's one of the reasons why people feel a bit cynical now. They feel a bit left out, a bit unheard, shall we say. And so, I see a lot of those signs in Australia today.
In terms of voter involvement and in terms of the idea of citizen and citizenry,
yes.
What's the responsibility lies back on the citizen to keep on asking questions or be towards fact-finding, always follow the lead of where the truth lies rather than the narrative on both sides. So how much of the responsibility of the functioning democracy sits back on the citizen, and then how might we assume agency from all citizens from a political point of view, because both sides will always run a short 3-word campaign. So there is a 3-word campaign which goes across the 6 weeks of, which is minimizing the agency. Why can't we have long-form argument on every challenge?
Yes.
So why can't that assumption happen that, let's drag it out the argument? You are minimizing the argument of either immigration or,
Yes.
energy or
Yes.
security. So by 3-word and then talk points,
Yes.
why can't we have a long form detailed discussion and let both sides give their enough evidence on the table?
Oh, doesn't that sound like a wonderful ideal world to be able to
Utopia.
actually have those long form discussions? So we used to have them when we were children, right? I mean, I remember going to even high school debating societies, and you'd have more long form debate than you do now for most bills that get passed, So yeah, why don't we have them? Incentives. I mean, I'm an economist. Right? Incentives. What are the incentives at play here? Political incentives by the politicians. They don't want to engage in long-form debate. It's not to their advantage. It's much easier to control people and manipulate them, particularly in the world of social media, lots of screens, swiping left and right, TikTok and Twitter, which are reducing complex, nuanced topics to, short 40-character representations. Cancel culture, which has developed on the back of all of this in part. People are overloaded with information and they are desperate to reduce it to bite-sized chunks so that they can process it in some manner. And they're very willing to just jump to conclusions. They're not practiced in really appreciating nuance and engaging productively in respectful discussion with those who may not agree with them. All these skills that I was schooled in when I was a little girl. And hopefully most people, I mean, I'm Gen X, hopefully most people in Gen X and above did have that sort of education, but has really fallen away in a lot of our education more recently. So you have 18-year-olds who have never actually had a serious discussion about whatever, topic X, climate change, abortion, whatever you want. They've never had a serious discussion about it. They simply, in their mind, have a position, and they've got a few talking points, and if challenged or asked, they'll spew out those talking points, and that's it. So why the incentives of politics, the technological revolutions in information delivery, which have produced this sort of laziness and lack of need to have those kinds of long-form discussions. People are content not to really worry about it. Their lives are very good, and materially speaking, and they have so much information to digest. They don't really want to take the time to worry about the broader questions that are under discussion that are really relevant to the broader society, not just to their lives, but to society as a whole. You need people who care about society as a whole, which is another unfortunate problem or lack in modern culture. I think we have a lot of people now whose horizons are extremely low. They are looking after themselves, their family, maybe their extended family, but they're not really thinking, how can I be useful to the world? How can I be useful to my country?
Yeah.
How can I be useful to the West? They're not thinking about that. And why? Well, again, what's the benefit from doing that? A lot of the time, if you look at a young person's incentives, what they'll see is that their most material benefit is had by specializing heavily in a very narrow area of study or research or professional training. And once they become that expert, that's how they can get status and money and people paying attention to them. But it's not to be a generalist who is looking holistically at all of the West or all of Western Australia or all of Australia and thinking, is this particular policy in this area that I haven't really become an expert in but know a little bit about and I can think about, is this really the best thing for us to be doing, or should we take this alternative policy?
Yeah.
That requires a different set of mental tools than what is presently usually developed in young people who are ambitious, which is to become a hyper specialist, a really, really strong specialist. So we've lost generalists. We've created this political machinery which gives rise to highly political careerist incentives that dissuade people from just really long-form debate and encourage them to put on a face, a show, a 3-word representation of things. There's no real gain for a person from engaging in those discussions unless you intrinsically love them, which I do. You probably do too. You wouldn't be doing this otherwise. And so it's a great joy, but it certainly isn't remunerative.
Yeah.
I mean, instead of doing this, if I wanted money, I would be in the consulting world. I wouldn't be an academic, first of all. If I really were motivated mainly by materialistic desires, I would absolutely not be an academic. And even as an academic, I wouldn't be doing this. I would be trying to get my next paper into the American Economic Journal, right, or American Economic Review, or Econometrica, or some other elite journal, right, which would then gain status and
a Nobel Prize.
The Nobel Prize, all that stuff, right? High status, blah, 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 right? And frankly, I just don't think that's the best way to help humanity, so I'm not going to do it. But that requires an intrinsic motivation, which just we don't inculcate now in our young people, even though I think there is a natural human desire to be useful and to help. I really do feel that. And you can say I'm biased because I know I'm like that. I've been like that since I was 10. But I see that even in young people today. They don't want to be limited by their own selfish ends. They want to see a higher purpose. They want to be put to a higher purpose. And so I think that the possibility is there for a re-inspiration of the young to reclaim and rediscover what we've lost in public debate and discussion.
I have this hypothesis. I'm not an economist, I'm an engineer. The old school Colosseum idea, when the king is doing something dodgy, it'll put a sports show on.
Yes.
And the case in point is Victoria. So that's the sports capital of the nation and the highest debt in the nation.
Yep.
So that's my hypothesis.
Yep.
I don't, just broadly speaking. But what do you see of that idea of when the public, the state is doing something wrong or something bad behind the back, it'll put a show on.
Absolutely.
So how do you see that playing across all states and federally?
I think that's absolutely 100% one of the big chapters in the playbook of the Manipulator, as we would say. I gave a TEDx talk a year and a half ago or so, which was banned by TEDx, but you can still find it, thanks to Jeffrey Tucker at Brownstone Institute, called The Manipulator's Playbook. And I talk about how it's a version of what you just said, a flavor of what you just said. So people's most sacred desires, particularly our love for each other, has been hijacked and reformulated, manipulated into manufacturing support for destructive policies over and over and over again. And we saw that in COVID, for example, when the state actors and the federal acting bodies, particularly the National Cabinet, were enacting policies which were very anti-human. They were very against what was good for the economy or people. But they would, what was the show they would put on? They would, of course, wrap it in the flag of protecting grandma, right? Or being safe, we're staying together, but we're apart, or whatever it was, these Orwellian statements. And people bought into that. So Brett Sutton would go on television every morning and give the COVID review, right? And I mean, it became a bit of a sex symbol. People bought into the circus that was put out there, which was not reflective, is not really actually representing or fairly presenting what the government was truly doing, what its actions were making happen. It was wrapping in the flag, essentially, wrapping in the flag this really negative policy dimension. But you also see this in areas where the show and the real policy are very disparate. So in Victoria, you mentioned sports versus going into debt, and of course the debt is used for many things, including just financing more government handouts, more government overreach, the COVID era debt, which they've gone into, the lack of dealing with things like the machete crime crisis, for example, with these bins. I mean, come on, very expensive bins, which are completely ineffectual, right? Obviously, and they're playing hide and seek with the actual really difficult, nuanced problems that state is facing in terms of its culture, its community life, its economy. There are so many problems that it has that are structural and that need to be addressed in a structural way. But it's much easier to say, "Oh, look over here. Here's something that you should pay attention to," right? And whether it's the plight of somebody who was poorly done by with regard to the NDIS program or some other thing, right? And then the government can portray itself as the savior and say, "Yes, we are here to actually improve the plight of this person. Watch how we do this." But in some other quarter, they're completely failing the people. So that happens all the time. And you just have to look at the headlines to figure this out. But it is a situation of walking through the looking glass. Before you've walked through the looking glass, and a lot of people, I think when they're young, have this experience, you read the headlines, you read what the government officials say, and you believe them. You think, yes, well, that sounds good. We certainly don't want our grandmothers to die, do we? So yes, we should do these things. We should lock down, and you're not really thinking through the logical consequences of things. You just take an authority figure's speech as reality. Once you see that most things that come out of politicians' mouths are actually intended to manipulate you into supporting what they want to do, which is not necessarily something good for people, then it's really hard to unsee that. And then you start seeing the distraction technique that you mentioned everywhere. You start seeing manipulation everywhere. You start seeing it as a drama, as Shakespeare said, the men and women are only players. Very true, particularly on the political stage.
What do you see the utility of the public service or the role. So two parts of the question: public service and the broader government at play.
Yeah.
And how do you see the function of the politics representing the views of the people are being, downstream effective through the public service?
Yeah. Well, I think if anybody's watched Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, those are glorious documentaries, I would say, not just comedic TV series, that really show you the difference between the deep state or the bureaucracy and the political class. A lot of people who come into politics back in those days, this was the 80s, I think that show was made, 70s, 80s, genuinely wanted to improve things for their constituencies. We didn't have quite the degree of career politician that we have today, this sort of whole architecture, this whole ecosystem of taking people in from they're 17 years old and training them how to speak well to an audience, and you put them into the young liberals or the young labor people, and then they become politicians and they just don't ever have another job. That wasn't as common back in the 70s and 80s. It happened, but it wasn't as common. So you had these idealistic politicians come in, like Jim Hacker, who was the person in Yes Minister. And then you have, underneath that layer, you have this deep state, this bureaucracy, which has its own kind of rules, its own systems, its own way of handling personnel rotation and everything. And these people often are, even then, 70s and 80s, career bureaucrats. They're career state servants.
Yeah.
And they kind of keep the machinery running despite what's going on in the political sphere. And that's the way they see themselves, right? So Sir Humphrey Appleby is the quintessential state bureaucrat who sees how his system runs, recognizes his own incentives, which are really to do with what's going on in his world, which is the deep state, doesn't really have to do with the people. Doesn't really have much to do with the politicians. In fact, he'll take some orders or requests from the political class, like Jim Hacker, and pretend to be advancing those orders, and actually just kind of white ant them in various ways because it's not beneficial for that state machinery and for him personally. So I do see that model is just what we generally have. Do I think that there is no role for a machinery of state? No. I would disagree with my anarcho-capitalist friends on that. I think we need to, for example, organize ourselves somehow to provide for the defense of a country.
Yeah.
I would not want that to be left in just private hands and that's it, right? I think that there is some role for providing things like food safety standards, potentially at the federal level, potentially some health and educational stuff that would be financed and to some extent guided by the federal level, but largely run and implemented at the local level for optimum results. So there is some degree of I think, efficiency, economic efficiency that can be gained by having some federal structure. There's a bit of stability you get. There's a bit of confidence, a bit of consistency, and not just for consistency's sake, but to get economic efficiency. Because consistency, often people play that card. Oh, we must have consistency across. Well, you don't often always need it, right? I mean, sometimes, yes, but you don't always need it. And oftentimes people overestimate how much you get in terms of human welfare from having consistent policy across all regions of a country. So, take something like the United States, which has, of course, also a federal system. You see that the federal government does have certain roles, but there's an awful lot that's left in the states' hands. They have a stronger federal system than we have here. And that was one of the most precious things that enabled them to see during the COVID era that it was possible to run a state without lockdowns or without many lockdowns and not experience COVID Armageddon. And if we hadn't had those examples, it would have been far harder in the United States to put up the argument, yes, we really didn't need the lockdowns, right? Having those 50 different petri dishes really enabled that to happen. So having more regional control enables you also to experiment with different policy settings and work out which one is actually the best, which one actually suits people. So yes, I do think that there is a role for the federal government, but I also think that we should increase, and we can increase, the oversight of citizens upon the machinery of state and upon the politicians. And I've suggested a number of ways to do this in many of the blogs that I've co-written for Brownstone Institute with my co-authors of The Great COVID Panic, Paul Freiders and Michael Baker. One of the suggestions that I really like that we've made, and we've fleshed this out now a little bit more, is the idea of citizen juries. So, as an example, the criminal system today works on the basis of establishing juries to decide whether a man is guilty or innocent, right? And when we are put on those juries, we generally speaking put some effort into it. Now, we don't just sort of sit on our phones and then say, whatever you guys want is fine, right? We actually genuinely try to engage with the other people on the jury. who often are of different opinions, different backgrounds, all this, and to try to come to a common understanding about what this evidence that we've been presented shows. Does this person seem to actually be guilty based on this evidence, or is there a reasonable doubt? And those juries can last for a day or a week or a month or a couple months, right? Take that same idea and put it into the sphere of having to make another kind of decision, which is who is going to be the next head of the Department of Immigration.
Yeah.
Instead of having Sir Humphrey Appleby and his mates appointed by the political class or by each other, which is often what happens now, put the appointment process into the hands of the citizens directly. So the citizens are on another roll, not just the criminal jury roll, but the citizen jury role that will then be called up potentially one time in your life to spend 2 or 3 months with your peers, your citizen peers, deciding who's going to be the next Department of Education head or Department of Health head or Department of whatever head. That is one job that I believe citizens could do reasonably well. It's not deciding on technical policy where you really have to be a technical SME, a subject matter expert, or a technical expert to be able to figure out. You just need to know who would be good at this type of job, which of course there'll be a job description, notion of what you need to be across, what you should be representing. If you establish such a jury, every time that a top bureaucratic head comes vacant, and you need to fill it with someone, then over time you establish a cadre of people who are in charge of the machinery of state, who are no longer like Sir Humphrey Appleby facing the incentives of his own personal career and those who put him in that place, which is the political class, again, the networked class, the kind of elites of today, but rather those who put him in power, which are the people. So you have more representation of the welfare of the people, ideally, and less so of the political class. So this is the beginning of more democratic voice over the machinery of state, such that the decisions made by that state machinery are more in line with what is actually good for the people.
We are right now talking when there's a war happening and there's supply issues of oil and gas globally. In the extreme ends, when you want to decouple your economy on basic resources from everything because you can produce everything in-house, and it's right, yes, Australia can produce, have resources under the ground or on the shores.
Yeah.
Where have we, in terms of the economic policy, the public policy in the last 20, 30 years, have failed to decouple us from these known factors? Because wars have been talked about. The last big war, which US overtook, also had similar repercussions on the demand and supply of on the supply of oil. So how have the economic policy either failed or not worked at all, not moved at all?
Oh, how do I count the ways? Obviously, we have the strategic fuel reserves issue, which has been not adequate, and when we are going to be finding that out pretty soon. We have failed to create what we could have done for the Australian people, a sovereign wealth fund, from the revenues from our great amount of natural resources. We have failed to create the stockpiles necessary to be able to provide in cases where we haven't been able to get those supplies. We've done better in certain sectors, so agriculture we do a bit better in terms of sort of being able to guarantee food security in cases where there are supply chain disruptions. I do think in general that diversification is a good thing, just as a general principle, and that includes getting diversified supply sources for whatever it is that you're using. And so I wouldn't say that it's a bad thing to be importing food from overseas sometimes. Yeah. I mean that's actually a good idea, because particularly I've written a paper about this in relation to certain crops that are highly specialized, highly geographically concentrated, and vulnerable to particular natural disasters, like bananas, for example. That was what my paper was about. You actually want to be able to import from regional producers like the Philippines more easily, so that if your domestic supply gets wiped out, you have an alternative supply. But of course, in the case of a war, or like the disruption that we're having now, what's being disrupted is not the domestic supply, but the foreign supply. And so there, of course, you want to be able to draw on domestic supplies, and to have those supplies available and not having delivered the infrastructure that is required to actually get those supplies to the people is very frustrating in a situation such as today's. And honestly, why has this happened? I think partly, again, this elite class, which is increasingly globalist in framework and orientation, has not really thought about what is good for Australia as a separate country, but much more what is good for sort of the world, one health, one security, one fuel, this sort of notion that we're all in this together. And the reality is, okay, it would be great if we all got along, kumbaya, etc. But the reality is people and states are very different from each other. They have very different cultures. They have very different desires, often strategic objectives. And you have to face that real world, real politic, I suppose. If you're going to be a good statesman, if you're going to be a good leader of a country, you are not just in cooperation with, but also in competition with other countries around the world. And it's sometimes the case that competition spills over into conflict. And you have to be able to see that your job, number one job, is protect the interests of the country that you are representing, not protecting the interests of the global community. And so we've gotten really carried away with this global community stuff over the last 20 to 30 years. To the point where people subscribe to things like the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, above subscribing to their own people's welfare, the advancement of their own people, the economic development of their own people. And that's really, it's almost what do they call it, suicidal empathy? You're believing in sort of the goodness and greatness of love for all without realizing that your own people are suffering and actually need to be prioritized in your policy setting. So I think it's that overarching change in perspective which has really done damage to Australia. And so again, a lot of my efforts are aimed at trying to elevate the discourse and make it more detailed, make us able to discuss things with more nuance, but also reorient people and citizens of Australia towards what is good for them, and to have them hold their politicians and their state accountable to deliver what is good for them, not just what is good for some hypothetical global body, One Health or whatever it is.
Coming to the same idea of incentives between the state and the defense, because the whole idea of one world, one institutions, and one goals, which you were talking about. Because when now there's a challenge, US is asking for everybody else to come and support the defense efforts in terms of supporting the opening the
Strait.
So from that point of view, how do you see from a defense point of view, why do people come together if they have to be kept different?
Why do people come together if they have to be kept different? I mean, strategic alliances are a part of military strategy and defense for as long as I can remember. And in any major conflict, you're going to see that, of course. And I think, Australia has benefited from being part of the Western alliance, broadly speaking, for many years, despite being in Asia, right? And I do think that we should have, should recognize our strategic position in Asia as an opportunity to be a port, to be like as Singapore has done, right? I mean, their developmental story is amazing, right? They really didn't have much, and then they've just decided, right, we're gonna actually become useful and sort of use trade as an engine of our own development and our own sort of enrichment, and that's worked really well for them. And we also have this position in Asia. It's one of the things that's propelled our international education industry, and we are seen as obviously a kind of beacon of the West in Asia. That can be a positive thing, but we are also a Western nation by heritage, and so our natural allies are the United States, Europe, Canada, New Zealand, these sorts of countries, as a first primary kind of layer, I suppose. Now that doesn't mean that we can't have free trade agreements with other bodies. Japan, South Korea, we have these kinds of things, and generally speaking, most economists think that free trade is a good idea. Certainly, when you're talking about at the same level of development. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a bit more of a question mark around free trade with developing nations because, as much as you want to trade, not aid, sometimes if you follow too exactly the prescripts of comparative advantage and the logic that you should specialize only in those areas in which you have a comparative advantage today, you may end up hampering your longer term, broader development. And so there is sort of a notion of, I think, a resurgence of the idea that Africa could have free trade within its borders, so similarly developed nations free trading with each other, but when you start free trading with a developed country, other problems may arise. But I think that, our natural ally are, of course, the West, and that's our identity. That's not going to go away. If we were, this secession that I'm working on now, if we were successful in that, I would certainly imagine that the new nation of independent Western Australia would form an alliance with the remainder of the Australian states on defense and free trade zone. We'd have certainly a visa-free, situation like the Schengen region in Europe, where you're able to move freely without a visa between the two countries. And in fact, our voice at the table in regard to conflict and negotiations in relation to anything international would be improved, because we'd have 2 seats at the table, not just one.
Coming on to that project then, if you can talk about what are the key pillars of conversations on the secession project of Western Australia, what are the key indicators, or what do you mean by saying that secession will happen, and what are the key trigger points for that?
Okay. So it is now early 2026, and we are expecting another state election in early 2029. That is, in some sense, the political target. If the people of Western Australia decide that what they are interested in is to secede from the Commonwealth, that would be the natural time that a referendum could be put to people and a new constitution implemented. The reason I'm working on this project is because I was asked by Julian Gillespie, who's the primary author on secession by Western Australia, and our essential argument is that Western Australia has been badly done by over the course of the Commonwealth since 1901, and even beforehand that was recognized. As a foreword to our book by Professor William Coleman, who is a political economist and historian, who goes into some depth about the situation back then in the 1890s and the resistance to federation that was felt by most people in WA who were not recent Eastern migrants to the goldfields. That was the main section of the country, of the Western Australian colony, which ended up voting in favor of joining the federation. But even after having joined, there was much regret about having joined. It was just not seen as something helpful. And then in 1933, there was another referendum that was given for the whole country, the whole state, I should say, of Western Australia, and that passed. So the people did want to secede. And this is, by the way, before the discovery of natural resources in Western Australia, right? So even then, before we even had the degree of natural resource wealth that we now know we have in this state, it was seen to be not a good thing on balance for the state. So even in 1933, it was recognized that it was not to Western Australia's interest to be aligned in federation. And that only failed because at that time, the legal structure was such that we needed to ask the UK's permission, and the UK said that it was, in turn, that it was the province of the Dominion of Australia as a whole to decide whether or not this secession would happen, which meant that Canberra would have needed to agree. Now, this is, in my mind, commensurate with or analogous to the situation where you have an abusive husband and you ask him whether it's okay if the abused wife leaves. It doesn't seem in line with principles of natural justice to say that should happen. And since 1986, the Australia Act and some other legal precedents that we go through in the book and that have been sketched out well actually by a PhD scholar recently, our feeling and on the team that has written Secession by Western Australia is that now it would be legally absolutely possible for WA to secede on the grounds of simply a referendum by the Western Australian people, not the whole country of Australia today. So we would need that referendum to go to the people, we would need it to pass, and then that secession would simply happen. Basic arguments, well, our estimates based on the publicly available data that we can get our hands on indicate that Western Australia is bleeding something on the order of $39 billion per year to the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth has grown from only costing something like $600 per person per year back in the 1950s, 1960s, to now costing a total of, I think it was $800 billion last year, and of that, something like a quarter, so $250 billion was federal salaries. And we just make the case that we don't think that this is money well spent in terms of the welfare of the Western Australian people, and even indeed the welfare of other people in the eastern states currently living in Australia. And our arguments in the book that are obviously backed up with a lot of research, and there's extensive referencing that you can find on the webpage that we have as well for the book, indicate that Western Australia would be able to maintain itself with a lean government if it were to properly tax the natural resources, the natural resource extraction, which at the moment is being let go for a song to companies that face much different situations in places like Norway or Qatar, for example. Norway, I believe, captures something like 78% of the value of the resources that are extracted from its sovereign territory. We here capture something like 1%. So it's very different. So what we propose propose as a tax base is a 20% universal royalty rate on those natural resource extraction activities, and then the elimination of income tax, the elimination of company tax, payroll tax, 13 different federal taxes. A few taxes additionally would still be maintained. So the GST we would have, an unimproved land tax, which of course is the tax that most economists agree is the least distortionary that we could think of, and maybe one or two others. But we would radically simplify the tax system, which would of course ease compliance burdens as well as easing actual payment burdens on behalf of both people and businesses, and make it possible to run a state government leaner, more efficient, and delivered more to the people of Western Australia. Commensurately with this, we envision a rejuvenation of communities and a devolution of power to communities following the principle of subsidiarity, whereby things like health and education are directed more at the community level rather than just at the state or it would be the national level. So much more consumer choice on health and education, and also in the financial realm to protect housing as an asset class, but otherwise make it much more feasible for people to open businesses, to take innovative action, which of course advances human well-being, as we know.
How do you see that the legality of organizing a referendum without the state government being involved, and how a public-facing referendum be involved without the electoral commission, which is a state body? How do you see that, the legality and the format and the structure of it?
Yeah. Basically what would have to happen, and this is not for us to do as the authorship team because we are scientists, authors, academics, professionals, but rather to hopefully hope that someone else does in the state, is to form a political party with the single mandate that if they get into power in 2029, in the early 2029 state elections, they will put the referendum to the people. The secession referendum, and if that passes, then they pass the Constitution. We have a draft constitution in the book. We've actually written up a full draft constitution. Obviously, it will need to be tweaked over the next few years. All of the things that are in the book, every chapter is provisional in the sense that it's our best shot, it's our gauntlet laid down, if you will. But we envision further consultation with the Western Australian community as well as with experts overseas on the various details, fleshing out each of the models into proper full white papers, reports, and also fleshing out the implementation plan. So how would you move from the current education system, let's say, to the system that we sketch out in the book, which would have a radically smaller university sector, much expanded TAFE and apprenticeship system, a lot more exchanges for high school students to different areas in the country, different types of education embedded into their high school knowledge, a return to civics and basic understanding of our place in the world, and reading, writing, arithmetic, obviously phonics, all that stuff, the good things that we know work to educate children in basic skills, and again, much more community involvement in education. How do we get to that model from, or whatever the model ends up being that we come up with in consultation with the Western Australian community, from the model that we currently have, right? That's going to be a multi-year process, of course, of implementing and transitioning to something that is, we think, more fit for purpose. And so that political party needs to be formed. I don't think it's going to be a Liberal, it's not going to be Labour. It's probably going to be a new party or a rejigging of some existing more freedom-oriented parties, perhaps the Libertarians. There's a Waxit party, I believe, that currently exists. Perhaps they would be interested in joining forces with others. But it would need to be a strong and united front that they put to the people and say, this is the only thing that we are standing for, is secession from the Commonwealth, based on the basic blueprints in this book and in the white papers that are yet to be developed, and to take that political case to the people. And if the people say they don't want it, well, that's it, right? That's it. I mean, we are led by the will of the people. So if you're watching and you're a Western Australian, if you want this, you gotta step up. I'm not gonna make it happen. Dev's not gonna make it happen. We can't make it happen on our own. This must be a popular sovereignty-led initiative.
In conclusion, if you can talk about, for everyday citizen, what are the key things they should be tracking as an economist?
Gosh, I look at a lot of things. If I were an everyday citizen, what would I look at? I'd look at the things that are important to me in my everyday life. So if I'm a citizen who's a farmer, I'd be looking at the weather forecast. I'd be looking at new science on seeds and agricultural techniques and land management. I'd be looking at animal husbandry techniques. I'd be looking at, all the various sciences related to my area. I'd be looking at markets for my products, the indicators of the prices for various things. But if I'm in the city, if I'm a finance expert, I'm looking at totally different indicators, right? As an economist myself, of course, I'm concerned with the welfare of the whole system, right? As per the engineer's perspective, right? How does this system work? What are the different bits and pieces, the interoperabilities that need to be there? And so I look at a lot of things. I look at betting markets in terms of projections for the future. I find they tend to deliver reasonable information. They're not always perfect, but they kind of are a crowdsourced market estimate for what's going to happen in the future, right? So they tend to be handy. I look at certainly some of the statistics that the ABS put out, so unemployment rates and interest rates and things like this, but you can't just look at that. Consumer confidence and other kinds of surveys that are done, often not just by the ABS, but also even in the HILDA, the Household Income and Labor Dynamics surveys, surveys that are done even by peak industry bodies sometimes are handy, just to get a sense of how frictional, what are the frictions in the labor market today, what are the frictions in trade, what are the frictions, because friction is something that's holding people back, right? Yeah. But on the other hand, you don't want zero friction sometimes because you want there to be enough time for people to think through the consequences of their actions, right? So you don't want people to just be able to do something immediately without really thinking about the broader consequences. So there's sort of an optimal amount of friction, I think, in the real world. And you also want information provision, right? And optimal access to information as cheaply as possible so people can make the best decisions. And so things like whether or not the government is investing in platforms such as My School. This is a particular example, right? My School provides information on how different schools are doing in relation to NAPLAN scores. Now, if I had my druthers, it wouldn't just be about NAPLAN scores, it'd be a lot wider. A picture of a school that you could get on this national government website. That would be a really useful thing for the government to do in relation to a lot of other things too. Child care quality, care of aged care facilities, a lot of caring stuff is really hard to get a measure of the quality, and government bureaucracies are notoriously bad at guaranteeing quality in these areas. So you want the markets to be leading that. You want local voice to somehow be available to people who are choosing which institution to use. You can do that with a kind of warehouse marketplace, sort of like we have Yelp for restaurants, right? Or other kind of crowdsourced quality. So I look for how much is government investing in those things, and what are we seeing in those areas? Are we seeing, potential, poor performers losing market share? Yeah? If so, that market's working a bit. Yeah. So I can't point to one measure. Although if I had to say, what would my pick be for the best measure of human thriving? Wouldn't be GDP per capita. Would actually be WellBees. So that's Wellbeing Year, which is a new currency. I used it in my cost-benefit analysis with Sanjeev Sadlock of the COVID lockdowns in 2022. Do lockdowns and border closures serve the greater good? We used the WellBe because we thought it's the best measure of sort of a holistic kind of gauge of how people are doing in life. And it's built on a question about life satisfaction. Overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? It does implicitly trust the person being asked to actually answer that honestly, to be able to make a reasonably holistic evaluation of his or her situation. And it's going to include lots of different things. It is partially financial security and things that we would think of as automatically measured in GDP per capita, but it includes many other things too. How well is my marriage going? Are my children happy? Is my health doing well? Do I feel that there's hope for the future? Am I respected in my job? Do I have autonomy? So many things, right? Is my car as nice as the guys next door, right? And all these things really matter to people. This is human nature. This is what we care about, and we should, I feel, trust people to know what is good for them at that basic level, and then build our policy to try to maximize that.
Thank you, Mr. Foster. Thank you.
It's my great pleasure to be here on the show.
Thank you.